Many of you know that my first church to ever pastor, I was like 25 years old, was in Lafayette, Louisiana. Now, I'm not from Louisiana. And so when God called us to Louisiana, we felt like he was calling us like to a foreign mission field. We lived in the next state, never lived in another state. So we felt like God was like pulling us across the world, just crossing state lines. And it was so out of our wheelhouse. And little did we know that it was very out of our wheelhouse. Lafayette is in South Louisiana. And pretty much everything below I-10 in Louisiana is a different culture. It's the Cajun culture. And I'd never been around anyone that was Cajun. And you might not have either, but it's a unique culture. There's a lot of pride in that. There's a really uniqueness to it. And so when we got there was a lot of adjustment that went on. One of the things that we had to adjust to is just understanding people, because they couldn't understand how they speak with this accent that's just, it's awesome, it's unique, but you can't understand it sometimes. There were people in our church that they had not known English all of their life. They grew up speaking French. And so English was kind of a new thing. And you could kind of tell that with some people because it just, what they said sometimes just didn't make sense. Another thing that was really difficult was pronouncing their names. They spell names normal, but the name is spoken differently. And that was very different. I had never met a person with the last name Boudreaux or Thibodeau or Primo, and we had those people in our church, and so there was a lot of other names like that too. I never forget, it was a couple weeks after being pastor there that I had to do a funeral. And one of the difficult things, just kind of let you in, is you want to make sure when you're doing a funeral that you look over the obituary before you read the obituary. Because you want to make sure that you say the names correctly. Well, I looked over this obituary and I thought it was a foreign language. Just to see all these last names of these Cajun people, I was like, how on earth am I going to do this? This is my first funeral. And so I got someone, can you help me pronounce these correctly? And so we sat down in the back of the funeral home and practiced it together. And he would say it and I would say it. And he would say, no, you don't say it like that. And so we worked on this. Well, I was so nervous by the time I got up there, I had forgotten everything and deeply offended the family and the family members by mispronouncing their names and all that. But one of the things that we loved, we came to know it very quickly with the Cajun culture and the people there was something about that culture. And they call it, it's a French word, it's the word lagniappe. And lagniappe means extra. And part of their culture is that they want to give extra. They want to bless people by doing more or giving more. And we came to know that was a really fun thing in their culture. So if you, for instance, if you ask somebody to help you and they're Cajun, they're going to come help you, but they're going to do something else for you. They're going to take it above and beyond. If you just wanted them for 30 minutes, they're going to give you 45 minutes, a little lagniappe, a little extra. They're going to go an extra mile, a little bit further for you. Simple thing. When you went to Chick-fil-A in Lafayette, they didn't just give you one Chick-fil-A sauce. They gave you two. A little bit of lagniappe, just to kind of make you smile and just kind of make you extra. And it went that way with just about everything. I mean, they were such gracious people to go beyond and above and to give you far more than you asked or expected or wanted. I used to absolutely love potluck meals because when you would go through the line and say, I would like some of that, they wouldn't just give you one something. They would look at you and say, lagniappe? I'm like, lagniappe me up, yes. And so in about probably 3 months, I lagniapped a lot more weight. I gained 30 pounds in like 3 months because they just kept lagniapping everything. It was a great culture. It was something, and it was a unique expression of something I think that's really unique about God. Is that he doesn't just provide for our needs. He doesn't just give us what we desire or what we need. He goes way beyond providing what we hope, what we ask, what we seek, what we think or know that we need. His grace is not just sufficient. His grace is abundant and overflowing, so much more than we could ever imagine. So we're in the story of Ruth, and where we left off last week, Ruth was seeking favor. She was seeking grace. She knew of this gleaning law, a widow who's in a foreign land trying to provide for her widowed mother-in-law as well. She's seeking some help. She hears of this gleaning law, and she stumbles upon a field, and she's going to work that day. She's going to try to see if she can get something for food that day. But what she finds that we're going to look at this morning is so much more than she could ever have imagined to find. She stumbles on the field, we're told in verse 3 of chapter 2, of a man by the name of Boaz. Now, we know, though she doesn't know, that this man Boaz, there's a whole lot more to him than just that he's a wealthy landowner. We know that there's some connection that we're going to see later in the story, that he is related to Naomi, Ruth's mother-in-law. And there's something that God does through that. But essentially, all we know, and all that Ruth knows, is she stumbled upon this land. What I want you to see this morning as we look at this story and this encounter, this first encounter between Ruth and Boaz, is how God displays through Boaz his grace. It's a picture not just of what God did for her, but of what God provides for us. So draw your attention to verse 4, and if you would stand in honor of God's word this morning. Ruth chapter 2, verse 4, Ruth has happened to come to the part of the field belonging to this man Boaz. And verse 4 we pick up, and behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem, and he said to the reapers, "The Lord be with you." And they answered, "Well, the Lord bless you." And then Boaz said to his young man who was in charge of the reapers, "Whose woman is this?" And the servant who was in charge of the reapers answered, "She is the young Moabite woman who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab. And she said, 'Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves after the reapers.' And so she came, and she has continued from early morning until now, except for a short rest." And then Boaz said to Ruth, "Now listen, my daughter. Do not go glean in another field or leave this one, but keep close to my young woman. Let your eyes be on the field that they are reaping and go after them. Have I not charged the young men not to touch you? And when you're thirsty, go to the vessels over there and drink what the young men have drawn." And then she fell on her face, bowing to the ground, and said to him, "Why have I found favor in your eyes, that you should take notice of me, since I'm a foreigner?" But Boaz answered her, "All that you've done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told me, and how you left your father and your mother and your native land and came to a people that you did not know before. The Lord repay you for what you've done, and a full reward be given to you by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." And she said, "I've found favor in your eyes, my Lord, for you've comforted me and spoken kindly to your servant, though I'm not one of your servants." And at mealtime, Boaz said to her, "Come here and eat some bread and dip your morsel in the wine." So she sat beside the reapers, and he passed to her roasted grain, and she ate until she was satisfied. And she had some left over. You can be seated. I want you to note that oftentimes God displays his grace through the hands of his faithful and obedient people. Boaz here in this story was a man that God displayed his grace to Ruth and Naomi through. That's what God desires to do in us, and that's what God desires to do for us. That oftentimes through his people, his hands and feet, our hands and our feet become his. And he expresses his kindness and his goodness and his love and his joy and his peace. I mean, all the fruits of the Spirit and patience. He displays who he is and who his character and blesses through the arms of his people. And that's the case here in this man Boaz for the person Ruth. God blessed her through him. Now, it tells us at the beginning of chapter 2 in verse 1 that Boaz is a noble man. He's a worthy man. Now, he would have been respected because he was a landowner and certainly because he's wealthy. People would have had respect. He was certainly a man that had sway in the community and had some clout in the community because of that. But we see a little closer in verse 4 that he wasn't just a powerful man and a strong man that garnished respect. He was a godly man. Notice how he greets his workers in verse 1. And it may not seem much because we're reading the Bible and we're in church, but just think about this setting. He says to them when he comes to the field, he comes to check the field, and what he says is, the Lord bless you. Now that may not seem too odd because, it is the Bible and we are in church, but how many of you tomorrow morning in your office, when you go to work, your boss, when he walks in, will greet you in that way? The Lord bless you. It's a little strange. It's a little peculiar that he'd come in that way. It tells us that he's a man that follows God, that cares about that. And his workers greet him back. Not in a way of just kind of diminishing it or feel like they're being pushed. No, they didn't despise it. They greet back and say, well, the Lord be with you. This is a whatever the case, this is a nice place to work. There's genuine compassion and genuine concern. He doesn't come on the scene and say, hey, how are we doing today? Hey, how come this person over here is not doing this? We see in Boaz some compassion for his people that worked for him, some concern and care for his people. And God uses him as an instrument of his grace, not just to Ruth, but also to these people that he's working. They didn't despise him either. They responded accordingly. Well, the Lord be with you. Just to note, people today despise religion and religiosity. And rightly so. People crave, however, authenticity. What Boaz does here, and the reason it's received so well, is likely because Boaz is being authentic. Whether they were religious people or not, whether they cared about God or not, we do know this, that in the time of Judges it said this, which is what setting and what period this is in. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. And to find a man like this, a wealthy landowner with employees that followed God, and from following God displayed that authentic compassion for people, was a unique thing, and it was not despised. He didn't wear his religion on his shoulder. He was just simply who he was, and who he was walking with God. One of the best witnesses, and the witness this world needs, is not a bunch of religious people who cover themselves with Christianity, but a bunch of honest and authentic people that follow God. And from our following God, to show our trueness of who we are, that we love people, that we love our God, that we care for people like God cares for people. People will not despise that. Rather, they're drawn to that authenticity. And so as he's greeting them, he notices something. He notices someone in the field, which tells us that Boaz wasn't just like any landowner. He wasn't a guy that just simply had land and hired a foreman and he hired the staff. No, Boaz cared about his people, and so he comes to the field that day and he notices someone that he didn't see before. And so he says to his foreman, hey, who's that? Whose young woman is that? And this is where we begin to see God display his grace, a grace that we find for us as well in the person of Boaz. And here's what I want you to note first as we look at this. God's grace takes initiative. God's grace moves first. It takes the initiative. It was Boaz that noticed Ruth. Ruth had no idea who Boaz was. Maybe by this point, later in the day, she's figured it out. Maybe someone's told her, well, this field belongs to Boaz. We don't know that, though. She doesn't know he's there. She doesn't know he's on the scene. She doesn't know anything about him at this point in time. But he notices her. He approaches her in a really kind way, and he notices her. The question he asks is who is this, and whose young woman is this? Which would mean is, who's she married to, or whose daughter does she belong to? I've never seen her before. His question is actually a question to figure out why she's here. Who's she married to? Who's providing for her? Who's her father? Why is this woman here in our field? Boaz knows that Ruth is not there for just no reason at all. What he's asking is really leading to the question of, is she one of the widows? Is she someone that I've allowed to come and glean my field? Which is another initiative that Boaz took. Period of Judges. Everyone did what was right in their own eyes. And even though there was a law that God established to make sure that you don't cover all the edges of the field, that you don't scrape the field dry, but you leave some on the ground for those who are poor, needy, foreigner, or widows. Not everybody was following that law, though. Everyone did what was right in their own eyes. And so those that were driven by greed would have not done that. Boaz stands apart by following the law that God established to provide for people. And so here he sees this woman and he is questioning and wondering, is she one of those? Does she need care? We're not told that he's impressed by her. We're not told that, she's good looking. All we're told is he wanted to know who was caring for her, whose woman does she belong to, who is over her. He took initiative. Before him, God took initiative to provide the law. And through God's servant who obeyed that law, this man took the initiative to care for her. It was the kindness of Boaz that followed the law. It was Boaz that noticed her. It was Boaz that inquired of her. He didn't have to be there that day. He certainly didn't have to ask questions about who is who. And he certainly didn't have to have any concern for stragglers like Ruth. But he took the initiative because that's what grace does. When it comes to God and you, he always takes the initiative. It's God that notices and loves and acts first. It's God that makes the first move. It's God that pursues you. Long before you ever even thought of him, God was in a pursuit that he initiated of you. John tells us in 1 John chapter 4, verse 19, we love because he first loved us. That's the heart of grace. He moved first. We're told this. Paul gives a great explanation of it in Ephesians chapter 2. In fact, I'm going to read several verses to you. He says this in verse 1, and you were dead in your trespasses and sins, which you once walked, following the course of this world, following the prince of the power of the air, the spirit that is now at work in the sons of disobedience, among whom we all once lived in the passions of our flesh, carrying out the desires of the body and of the mind. We were by nature children of wrath, like the rest of mankind. But God, being rich in mercy, because of the great love with which he has loved us, even when we were dead in our trespasses, made us alive together with Christ. By grace you have been saved, because God took the initiative. And that's what grace does. That's what God does for us. And this initiative drove him to something else I want you to see about grace. Not only does grace take the initiative, but grace also speaks. So his foreman is explaining him, this is who this is. This is this young Moabite woman. You may have heard of her, Boaz, and she's come over with Naomi from the country of Moab, and she's been here all day. She's been gleaning from the morning until now. She took a short break, and Boaz in verse 8 interrupts these men, and he goes and speaks to Ruth. Boaz said, now listen, my daughter. Boaz spoke first to Ruth. Ruth would not have dared to speak to him. We're not even sure that Ruth is even aware who he is or that he's even there that day. There were a lot of barriers that would have prevented Ruth from ever speaking to Boaz. One she was a woman and he was a man, and it was inappropriate in that culture and setting for a woman to approach a man and to speak to a man first. Furthermore, she was poor and he was rich. There was a class difference, and it was inappropriate. It was not kosher for a lower class person to seek out an upper class person for any reason. But what is even more is that she was a foreigner. She's an alien. She's not from Israel. She's from Moab, and she's come to live in Israel. She's come to live in this place where she's not welcome, really. And she's different than everyone else. She's a different ethnicity. She probably speaks a different language and has different, you can tell that she's a different person. You can tell that she's not a Jew. And she's gleaning his field. She's there by this guy's mercy. She's certainly not gonna go and say, hey, is this your field? Are you the one that let me come out here today? So he speaks to her first. It says that he interrupted his men to speak to her. That's something that you and I need to know about grace and the grace of God, is that grace speaks. God initiated what he did for us through Jesus, but he initiated it through his word. Genesis chapter 1, verse 3. And God said. Hebrews chapter 1, verse 1 tells us this. Long ago and many times and in many ways, God spoke through our fathers by the prophets. But in these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son, whom he appointed the heir of all things, through whom he created the world. John chapter 1, verse 1. In the beginning was the what? Word. The Word was with God and the Word was God. Fast forward to verse 13, and the Word became flesh. God, by his grace, spoke. He has spoken to us, and through his spoken, which is revealed clearly through the Word, his Son, he has revealed to us who he is. We didn't know without that. You can't know God without the Word. You can know about God. You can know some things of God. You can know that there's a higher being and that we're accountable to him. But you don't understand and know God's holiness and his righteousness and his justice, his love, his mercy without that word. And he put the word in flesh so we could see this word face to face, and so that we could see ourselves in the face of this word, and so that this word could express what he's going to do for us and do it in flesh and blood through salvation. He spoke by his grace, and that speaking means everything to us. He's come close, he's pressed in, and he's spoken up to us. And I want you to understand that he still speaks today through his Spirit. And right now his Spirit is initiating contact with you in your life through situations and scenarios, through his written word, trying to show you who you are, trying to show you who he is, and trying to show you what he's done for you. That's the grace that speaks. And so Boaz speaks to Ruth. And he says, hey, my daughter. Which obviously tells us that likely Boaz is older than Ruth, and also a term of endearment. But it's also positioning Boaz over Ruth as a protector and a provider. And that's the third thing I want you to see about God's grace, is that grace protects and provides. So he says, come, now listen, my daughter. And then notice what he says. Do not go to glean in another field or leave this one. What Boaz says is, listen, I'm going to provide for you. There may be other fields and there may be other places, but I want you to understand this field, my field, is all you need. Through this field, I'm going to take care of you. Don't go somewhere else. Don't go look at you. You're just fine here. I'm so glad you found this place. I'm so glad that you're here. I got you. I got it. There's the provider, that I'm going to provide for you. And then he says this, the protection, and keep close to my young women. Go after them. Like there were women that worked for the field and served in different ways, some that picked up and gleaned as well. And he says, stay close to them. So he's putting her in a position of a servant, a position of someone that works for him. He's giving her a new title. She came on the field as a widow in need, and now she's given a position of servant and of one of the women. Stay close to them so that you're not all alone and you're not just by yourself. But then listen to what he says next to her. Have I not charged my young men not to touch you? Somewhere in the conversation with the foreman, before he speaks with Ruth, he makes a couple of decisions. He makes a decision in his heart and his mind that I'm going to provide for this woman through this field, and I'm going to let her stick with my other young women. But they also says to his foreman, hey, you make sure none of our men touch her. Providing protection. I love that statement. You make sure I've charged no young men to touch you. Now, some of us may really appreciate Boaz here in this. I've got a 6-year-old daughter. And I grieve the day some knucklehead boy wants to take her out on a date. I mean, I'm praying against that day, and I really don't think that day that God's going to answer that prayer. She's a pretty girl, and she's funny and sweet and blah, 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 all that kind of stuff. Boys like her already at 6. So one day, when that happens, and this young man shows up at my house to take my daughter, I'm going to pull the Bible out. And I'm going to quote Boaz. Maybe add a little bit to it. But the summary is, do not touch this girl, or I will touch you, boy. This is a threat, but listen, let me take, what he's doing is protecting her. Knowing that she's in a vulnerable situation, that she's far from home, that she's in a foreign land, that she's a widow. She is in a situation where she could have been taken advantage of. She could have been coerced. She could have been captured. She could have been kidnapped. She could have been treated horribly, trafficked. But Boaz takes the position of, listen, you're under the protection of me. I've made sure that in this field with these people, you are safe. But then he takes it further. Look, notice what he says. When you're thirsty, go to the vessels and drink what the young men have drawn. So you don't have to bring your own water bottle. You don't have to bring your own thermos. You can drink from what my workers are drinking from, which is interesting that what the young men have drawn. Likely one of the roles the women would have had that in the field was that they would draw water for the men. They would keep the men, nourished and give them water and so forth. But this is what the men have. This is when they got to go get their own. And he's saying, listen, you can drink from that. He's providing for these needs. But then he goes from generosity, borders, though, on extravagance. Look at verse 15. So when she rose to glean, Boaz instructed his young men. Now, he's already said, don't touch her. But now he takes the protection way further and says, let her glean even among the sheaves, and do not reproach her. And also, hey, pull out from the bundles for her and leave it for her to glean. And do not rebuke her. What Boaz is telling these men is, listen, you bring this girl Ruth and you bring her up to your level. You bring her with you. You let her walk amongst you. And as you are picking the grain and as you are harvesting, you make sure she's up in the middle of that she gets the first pick and she gets the first take. But I also want you to go beyond that. Drop some on the ground. And if you leave something behind, leave it there. let her have it. You make sure that her hands are full, that her bags and baskets are full of grain. You provide for her more than what we're supposed to do, more than what the law commanded. You see, Boaz is not a guy that just simply does the bare minimum or what is required. Boaz abundantly and extravagantly goes above to give grace through his protection and through his provision. All this for a foreigner. All this for someone that's not of the tribe of Israel. What a picture of the grace of God. Because in this picture, Boaz, as the master of the field, as the owner of the field, becomes the servant to this foreign widow. It reminds me of something that Jesus says, that the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve. Christ came as a servant. Paul reminds us of that in Philippians chapter 2, verse 5. Have this mind among yourself, which is also yours in Christ Jesus, who, though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God something to be grasped, but he made himself nothing, taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men. He came as a servant. The Master, the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords, stoops by his grace to serve foreign, sinful, wicked people like us. We don't deserve this. We didn't earn this, just like Ruth didn't earn this. He shares his riches. Boaz shared his riches that day. Let her come up close. Drop some on the ground. Give her more. And that's what Christ does for us. Ephesians chapter 1, verse 18, Paul says this, having the eyes of your hearts enlightened, that you may know what is the hope to which he's called you, what are the riches of his glorious inheritance in the saints, and what is the immeasurable greatness of his power towards us who believe, according to the working of his great might. And he even shares his glory. Philippians chapter 4, verse 19. My God will supply every need of yours according to his riches in glory in Christ Jesus. Grace protects and provides. Fourth, grace encourages. Verse 10, having seen the protection and some of the provision already, she asked the question. Notice verse 10, fell on her face, bowing to the ground, and she said to him, why have I found favor in your eyes, that you would take notice of me since I'm a foreigner? What we see displayed in Ruth is great humility. Ruth doesn't approach this as, well, I really appreciate that because I was really in need and I was looking for somebody to help me out. And, you Jews are supposed to be helpful people. You people of God are supposed to be helpful people. So I kind of expected this, and really nice of you to do this. That's not her attitude at all. Nor does she say, well, I'm so glad you did this because I didn't know what was going to happen with me today. You know I'm a widow. You know I'm a foreigner. You know I'm a young woman that everybody's been looking at me in this field, by the way. I really feel uncomfortable in this field, so I really appreciate that because I didn't know what was going to happen. I don't feel very safe. And, my mother-in-law won't even get up and work. I came all the way from here. I'm tired from this journey. I'm really glad somebody finally did this because I was in great, great need. Ruth neither looked back at her tragedy, nor did she look at herself, consider her sorrow as though she was entitled for something to be done to her. She did what we ought to do before our gracious Master. She fell on her face, bowed to the ground, and said, why? I don't deserve this. And Boaz encouraged her. He didn't say, no, you really don't deserve this. You're right, I'm a good man. No, that's not what he said. He actually said, listen, not that this is why I'm doing this, but Ruth, you understand, you're a kind woman. What you've done has been known. This is where it begins to click. Boaz knows who Naomi is, his relative. And here he has the opportunity to provide for one of his relatives. And this foreign woman has provided for his relative that he was obligated to provide for. I mean, he's astonished, and he's certainly taken back by her kindness. Here we see this beautiful picture of kindness meeting kindness. Isn't it awesome when that happens? When people of God live out the character of God in their lives, and it meets. Man, our world needs more of that. And so verse 13, she said, I have found favor in your eyes, Lord. You have comforted me. You've spoken kindly to your servant, though I am not one of your servants. She does not demand that Boaz do something for her. She does not come to Boaz as if he's obligated to meet her needs. She is shocked and surprised by his grace towards her. What a stark contrast to the way we approach God so much today. That we come to God expecting and demanding him to meet our needs. We come to church expecting this place to meet my needs, to be there for me, to give me what I want. And when it's not met, we get angry at God. We get mad at God. When we don't have things the way that we want to have them, we respond with, well, he must not be there, or he must not really be that great, or he must not really be that good. You know what that's called is pride. It's elevating yourself above God. The position that God wants us to take to receive his grace and understand his grace fully is one of humility, realizing and recognizing the truth that we don't deserve anything, and that before this mighty, awesome God, we are unworthy. And so rather than coming to church or approaching God with, what's in it for me? What you got for me? What's the preacher got for me? What's the worship got for me? We ought to come like Ruth, bowed on our faces, humbled before him, to worship one that is greater than any need that we have. And watch his grace do the fifth thing: satisfy. In verse 14 and in verse 18, we're told of her satisfaction. We see that she set amongst the reapers, and he passed her roasted grain until she ate, until she was satisfied, and she had some left over. You've been there. You know that feeling that she has. You ever eaten a meal, and I know you have, you've eaten a meal and you just thought, man, that's a good meal. In fact, it's so good, I can't finish it, it's that good. Now, I've had a lot of meals where I'm like, I can't finish it because it's not good. But one of those meals that you just, it's so much, like you're so full, like you need a nap. That's satisfied. One of these meals, and you get to that place and there's some left over. And the funny thing about this that we see is in verse 18. It tells us, and she went up and she went to the city. So she goes back to her mother-in-law, and her mother-in-law saw what she had gleaned, and she brought it out and gave her what food she had left over after being satisfied. I think that's funny because here in human history, we have the first to-go box. She had food left over, and she said, hey, can I get a bag or a box to take this home? And so she brings out what she has, and she says, check this out, all this stuff that I have. And guess what? I got a leftover lunch too. You want some? It's chicken fried steak. He brought the gravy as well. She's satisfied, full, more than she could have ever imagined before. Which is exactly what Boaz wanted to do. That's why he says in verse 8, don't go glean in another field. Because behind all of this, Boaz wanted to meet the needs of this woman. And Boaz wanted to give more than what this woman needed. He wanted to show and express grace and goodness to her. Because that's what God desires to do for us. He doesn't just want to meet your need. And the awesome thing about God, because we don't have to have this, he doesn't have to do any of this for us, but he meets our need of salvation. He meets the need of the punishment and the penalty for our sin and death in Jesus Christ. But he doesn't stop there. He gives us more. He gives us his peace and his mercy, his love and his compassion and his comfort and his care and his guidance and his help and his nourishment to fill us up. And if that's not enough, you can grab a doggy bag or a box and get more to go with God, because there's always more with him. You never run out. There's always more that he has for you. His grace is satisfying. And just as Boaz said to Ruth that day, don't go to another field. God says, listen, don't look for what I have somewhere else. Man, don't go to that other religion and that other false god. Man, don't go to success. Don't look for this in relationships and in friendships and in people. Don't look for this in money. Don't go look there. Don't glean there. Don't go look for this in that bottle or in that drug. Don't go look for this in that entertainment. Don't go look for this on that website. I've got what you need, and I've got more than what you need. Find it in me. Come after me with it. Humble yourselves before me and come, because his grace desires to satisfy us with his grace. Isaiah chapter 55, verse 2, listen to the voice of God. Why do you spend your money for that which is not bread, and your labor for that which does not satisfy? Listen to me diligently, the Lord says, and eat what is good, and delight yourselves in rich food. Psalm 63, 5. My soul shall be satisfied as with fat and rich food. Psalm 65, 4. We shall be satisfied with the goodness of your house. Psalm 103, verse 4 and 5. Who redeems your life from the pit? Who crowns you with steadfast love and mercy? Who satisfies you with good so that your youth is renewed like the eagles? His grace and his favor alone can satisfy. In Psalm 107, verse 9, for he satisfies the longing soul, and the hungry soul he fills with good things. It's a great connecting point here in this verse. We see it in what Boaz says to her in verse 12. The Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. It's a great picture. It's a picture that we see elsewhere in the Old Testament. God's wings, under the shadow of his wings, under the care of his wings. And the picture is one of a mother bird spreading her wings to shield and to provide and to protect for her children. And God has his wings spread out and those wings spread as his son spread his arms to be nailed to that cross. So that you and I, under the shadow of that wing, can have everything our soul and life needs satisfied in him. Don't go looking elsewhere. Let's pray.